This is the outline for non-discriminatory assessment in general, and these are the first 8 steps of it. You might recognize this from NASP's best practices. It's the chapter on non-discriminatory assessment, and I actually wrote that. But I don't have time to go into all of this today. These are the first 8 steps, but there's an additional 2 steps down here, and our focus for today is really on step number 9. This part of it, though, is very, very important. And although I don't have time to talk about the pre-referral framework and so on, that's where you're going to gather a lot of your information regarding the background of the individual. And more specifically, what I would call the difference. You need to know how different is the child you're working with as compared to a native English-speaking or monolingual English-speaking student. That's what you need to determine. Now, you could do that even after you begin the evaluation, but that just means a lot more work. If you're gathering RTI data, you could certainly use that as a part of determining that difference, but you have to know what are the factors in that child's background that can affect them. We were talking, I think Sarah was asking about, or telling me about the Burmese population in Fort Wayne, right, growing and large, and many kids coming from refugee camps. Well, I don't know if you've ever been to a refugee camp or lived in one, but that's a really different experience. And children coming from that kind of background are experiencing things that are vastly different. In fact, Tish up front here was telling me about a kid from Cuba and being, astonished at a grocery store because of all the food. And that's something I had heard, that during the Cold War, when the Soviet premiers would come to the United States, one of the first places they wanted to go visit was a grocery store because they could not believe just the vast amounts of food freely available to people out there. So the experiences are very different, and you need to know that. And you need to know how different that child is. The more different they are, the more their scores are likely to be attenuated. And I bring this up primarily because although we're about to focus on testing and how we use the testing in the purpose of evaluation, everything that I'm teaching you today is just but one step in, say, the context of a broader frame of non-discriminatory assessment. So you'll have to get the other stuff, just by reading it perhaps, but know that even though we're concentrating here, it's not the end-all be-all, but it is an important place to start because we use a lot of tests. Now, we often think, the tests we're using are biased, right? All I had to do was come in today, tell you which test to use, and everything would be fine, right? Just use this test. Thank you very much. Any questions? No, it doesn't work that way. Tests, in fact, are not biased when you look at these particular elements of bias, or when you define bias in terms of psychometric properties of the test, you don't find it. You really have to have a bad test, a very bad test, to find evidence of bias related to things like the items or the structure, test reliability, factor structure, and so on. You're just not going to get it there because these are not areas in which you find bias. We set up the test. We developed it in a certain way that will not produce problems in this area. So the research has been fairly clear, and I know that seems very surprising, but tests by and large, especially modern day, well-normed, well-developed tests, are not biased when it comes to these items. Where they are biased relates only to this one. It's validity, not reliability. Your tests are very reliable. Any test that you may choose to use is probably going to be very, very reliable. But the relationship between reliability and validity, if you recall, is kind of like this. Remember, this is a circle, and if I put all tests in that circle, then that becomes the universe of all tests, right? Now, some tests are reliable, some are not. So I can draw a circle within that one and put an R for reliability, and that means the tests within that circle are reliable, tests outside of that circle are unreliable. Do we care about unreliable tests? Do we even use them? Do they get published? Unreliability is kind of like a bathroom scale. Would you buy a bathroom scale if it were accurate plus or minus 200 pounds? Maybe minus, right? Yeah. You might buy it because some days you'd feel really good about yourself, and other days like, oh my God. So it's not accurate, not reliable enough to even be useful, right? Same with the thermometer. If you're trying to measure outside temperature and your thermometer is off, 1 to 2 degrees, big deal? No, unless you really, really care about being super accurate. You would care if you wanted a thermometer for the purpose of measuring, let's say, the temperature of your sick child. Do you want that one to be plus or minus 2 degrees? You want that one plus or minus 1/10 of a degree, right? You really want to know exactly what that fever is. So reliability is just that, how accurate something may be and whether it's consistent over time, like your bathroom scale. All right, if your bathroom scale gave you a random number every time you stepped on it, would you buy it? Well, maybe sometimes, right? Because you'd be really happy. You'd be like, oh, I weigh 6 today. 6, just 6 pounds. But the next day I weigh 1,000. So, oh my God, I'm not going to buy. So reliability is that. Validity is like this. It's the center of that target. So tests that are valid are also reliable. In other words, they must be reliable. If they're not reliable, they cannot be valid. Do you get that? And that is what's most important. This is why we don't see any problems. It's not a problem with reliability, it's a problem with validity. When I measure the ability of somebody who speaks absolutely no English whatsoever, am I confident that I actually measured their visual processing capabilities? No. I don't know what I measured, and more likely than anything, I measured their comprehension of English. That's about it. So when I don't measure the thing that I'm trying to measure, I have problems with validity. And that's really the key. Acculturative differences and linguistic differences affect the validity of your results, not the reliability. All right? We can measure anything we want. If I give you a test of English vocabulary and you don't speak a word of English, what's your score going to be? 0. Does that mean I failed to measure your vocabulary in English? No. I measured it precisely. You have no vocabulary. But if I want to know why you have no vocabulary, it's not fair for me to say you have a language disability, is it? It's not fair because that's not correct. You might have no language disability whatsoever, but I didn't measure you in a language you could respond in, so therefore I got the wrong impression. So that's what we're all about. Test selection and interpretation are other issues that people often bring up, but those aren't inherent properties of tests. You can select tests to do whatever you want them to do, and when you're very familiar with them, you can choose certain ones for certain purposes. But that doesn't make the test itself biased. It really makes what you do biased. And test interpretation is also not something that is an inherent problem of the test. It's more how the person chooses to interpret the results that they have. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. So basically, we have to understand that tests are cultural objects. They contain cultural content. We can't get away from that completely. We try, but we can't. And we can't get away pretty much from language either, at least not communication at all. And I'm going to show you how those things work. But we just have to recognize that just because they have that and are embedded with the content in the language doesn't mean that we can't use them. The two issues, as I've already pointed out, are acculturative knowledge acquisition and the developmental language proficiency. And this is different than dominance. I know a lot of procedures call for you to evaluate the language dominance of the individual. And then they tell you, evaluate in the dominant language. Okay, so what does dominance mean? You speak one language, you speak another. If you know 10 words in one language and you know 6 words in the other language, you're dominant in the 10-word language. Does that mean you're proficient in that language? No. You could be limited in both languages, but still have one more dominant than the other. All dominant tells you is one is relatively better developed than the other. And all that does is tell you when I test in that language, I can expect a little bit better performance. Not necessarily a whole lot. And it does nothing to guarantee that your results are valid. That would only work. Dominance would only work in the case of individuals who are, I would say, at least balanced bilinguals and biliterate. Because then you could choose either one, and they're going to perform equally well in either one or close to it. So it's not about language dominance, it's about proficiency, and it's about being an English language learner, which means there are differences in the developmental experiences and differences in the acculturative knowledge acquisition. When you grow up in a refugee camp or poor in Cuba, what you've been exposed to is not the same as what children have been exposed to here in the U.S. It is vastly different, and that content shows up on our tests, as I showed you in the very beginning. Now, I know many of you were taught one of these 4 ways, and perhaps even more than one of these ways, to evaluate children who are culturally linguistically different, right? These should all look very familiar. Well, let's go through them and find out which ones really are evidence-based, which ones are not, what are the advantages, disadvantages of each, so we can figure out what to do. All right, first is modified and altered assessment. This goes by testing of the limits sometimes, and you might have been taught how to do this. Clinical practice does a good deal of this. And the idea is you somehow modify the administration or the scoring or something so that you enable the person to perform more closer to their capability, more closely to their actual ability. Now, when you do that, all right, for example, repeating instructions, changing the time constraints or eliminating them altogether, accepting responses in either language, if it's not a part of the standardization of the test, then you are violating standardization when you do so. Now, I'm not concerned or worried about the standardization police and whether or not they're going to arrest you, because I know they won't, okay? But I am concerned about the validity of the results. And if you violate standardization, guess what? You can't stand on the validity of your results. You've effectively eliminated it. All right, now let me be plain on this, because you have to understand this. You cannot assign meaning or interpret your results in any way, shape, or form if you have violated standardization because you have introduced error. And error by definition occurs in an unknown amount, to an unknown degree, and you don't know how much of it has been introduced by your alteration or your modification. Therefore, your results mean nothing. And if you interpret them at that point, you're engaging in malpractice. You can't do that. It's not allowed. Do you understand? Clear, okay? I know, I get real, well, it's important because I see people do this all the time. They'll say things like, I don't know, maybe it's just a training kind of thing, but I grew up Catholic, and it reminds me of the idea of absolution. You know how you're taught to go to confession, you confess your sins, and then you get absolved, and everything's happy. You're like shiny, new, clean again, right? Well, people do this when they get the results, and they say, you know, because this person is English learner or comes from this background, the results should be interpreted with extreme caution. And then what? Do you ever see anybody interpret with extreme caution? How exactly do you do that? Do you like take the paper and the scores and you go, okay, that was an 85, maybe. Is that cautious enough? I don't know. You know, you've never taken a class in your lives, in your training programs or in your current training programs. Have you ever taken Extreme Caution Interpretation 101? There is no such thing, right? It just doesn't exist. You either interpret or you don't. And people just put that in. It should be interpreted with extreme caution. Then you continue reading. How do they interpret? Exactly as they would for any other child, following the straight guidelines that are provided by the publisher or whatever other kind of method they might use. There's no alteration, concession, adjustment, consideration of anything. Because once you say those words, should be interpreted with extreme caution, you're absolved of your forthcoming sins, apparently. But anyway, don't do that. Translator, interpreter. Sometimes you're thinking, oh, for legal compliance, if kid is LEP, and this is true, you are, by law, under IDEA, required to evaluate the child in their native language. Now, IDEA says, comma, not period, unless it's otherwise not feasible to do so. And I'm not trying to give you a loophole here, but what I'm saying is, IDEA recognizes that if you have nobody who lives in the county in which the child is attending school, who is capable, qualified, and competent to conduct the evaluation in the native language, you may evaluate in an alternative manner. You specify what that manner is, you follow it, then you're good to go. OCR will not ding you for that. They will say you had no choice, that's okay. But if anybody lives in the county, your district has a responsibility to hire that person to actually conduct it. Not that all districts would do that. You're supposed to keep a list of people ready and able to do that, by the way. But that's not what typically happens, right? What happens is we say, let's go get a translator-interpreter. That's the easy way to do it. Now, how many tests do you know are normed precisely on the use of a translator-interpreter during administration? I'll wait. I'll be patient here. 0. None. So that means if you use one, guess what? I don't care how well trained they are. I don't care how much they know about anything. You violated standardization. And what does that mean for your results? Goodbye, right? You cannot then interpret your results. Now, I'm not saying don't do these things. What I'm saying is understand the limitations of what you can do with these things. Can we make sense of scores? No, we can't even use scores at this point. What can we do? Well, this is great information sometimes because this translator-interpreter might understand that child better than the person does. For example, if you're working with me and I'm a kid, I'm a Puerto Rican kid, and you want to evaluate me or give me a vocabulary test or something, all right? The translator-interpreter may understand things you wouldn't. For example, of course, that's assuming they understand the culture as well as the language, because you might show me a picture of, let's say, a bus. and you're thinking, okay, bus is easy, they should get that. So the translator interpreter says, what is this? And I look at the translator interpreter, and I so confidently look at you, and I go, oh, it's a guagua. And you're waiting for autobus or camion. And the translator, who's Mexican, not Puerto Rican, looks at you and says, I don't know, he says something like guagua. I think he's thirsty. He wants some agua or something like that. I don't know. Okay, and you think, oh, didn't get a basal on that one, did we? We got to go back. So you go back and you show me a picture of glasses. You're waiting for, and the interpreter is waiting for lentes, anteojos, gafas. What do I give you? Espejuelos. And now the interpreter's like, I don't know, he said something about espejuelos. I think that's like something you eat, right? Instead of glasses, which it really is glasses in Puerto Rican. And then you say, oh, didn't get a basal. So you go back, you show me a picture of an orange. You only have one thing to look for. Your interpreter is thinking there's only one word for that, naranja. So you've got to know that the kid's got to get this one because it's the easiest item. And I look at you and I'm just so happy and proud to tell you that is a china. And now the interpreter knows I'm completely confused because he turns to you and says, he thinks it's China. When in fact, I gave you appropriate and proper words for all those objects in Puerto Rican Spanish, not Mexican Spanish. And because of that, you would mark me wrong. So even using a translator-interpreter is not going to guarantee that you're getting accurate results. And it's this kind of language variation, the translation issues that go on. I just thought of this the other day, and I want people to try this. Try to translate "you've outdone yourself" into another language. Can you do that? You've outdone yourself. You all know what that means. It's a nice English idiom. It just doesn't, I can't do it. In Spanish, it's not going to work. So you have problems. Now, again, even though we cannot stand on the scores, they can observe the behaviors. If your translator-interpreter were Puerto Rican like me, when I said those words, they would tell you, yeah, he's using actual words. I know that's not in the protocol in the way that it works, but those are the words that are used. China, by the way, comes from the word China. It does come from China because oranges were first cultivated in China and then exported, and they were imported into Puerto Rico. Puerto Ricans knew them by the country of origin because they didn't have a name for them. So they just called them China because that's where they came from. To this day, they're still called China. It's not like they don't know naranja, but China is the most common word. Yes, question?
That's what I wanted you to explain.
Oh, okay. Where China came from? That's where it comes from. So espejuelos, I have no idea. And guagua actually comes from, it's a Caribbean word in use. It was the name of a type of vehicle that existed. And it was written in a certain way that the people pronounced it guagua. And so it became known, but it was like the manufacturing name of the bus. And so it was just adopted as the name of the bus. So that's how those kinds of things happen. So what do you do? If you're doing this, you're attempting to do this, do it this way. Give the test in English in a standardized manner first, whatever test you want to. And once you're finished doing your testing in English in a standardized way, you want to, because you need to use an interpreter translator, go back and redo your testing. Go ahead and do it absolutely parallel. And for those of you, don't worry, because I hear you, the panic setting in, practice effects. All right? What are you, researchers? No, you're practitioners, okay? I worry about practice effects because I have to do research. You don't need to worry about that. Why? Practice effects are diagnostic. You're going to tell me you gave the test to a kid in English. He didn't understand hardly any of it. Then you came back with the translator-interpreter. Now you explained it to the kid, and the kid did better, okay? And you're going to think, oh, it was just practice effects. Okay, maybe it was practice effects, but it was also the language comprehension that helped. And if the child is able to perform better simply because you presented the task once before without any instruction, without any intervention, and now they improved, what does that say about the child's capability for learning in the classroom? Pretty darn good, right? It's the kid that doesn't have the practice effect that you're worried about. So when the kid demonstrates it, boom, there's no problem. Nothing wrong with that child. So that would be the way to do it. The usage of a translator-interpreter is likely then not for the purpose of getting numbers, right, or evaluating practice effects, but for qualitative analysis. What you're going to do here is you're going to validate what you found in the first place with your English language testing. I'm going to show you how to make sense of your data in English in terms of whether it is valid or not. If it's valid, you continue on. Your translator-interpreter can help verify that the problem that you've identified, is indeed a problem for that child. if your English testing shows there was no problem to begin with, the results are invalid and the range that was obtained is within, as you're going to see, the average or expected range, then you're done. There is no need to evaluate any further because you can now say you have identified this as a difference and that you believe there is no disability in that child. So it'll become a little bit more clear as we go ahead, but that's the basic idea. Now, those of you who are bilingual, well, those of you who are not bilingual, have probably been taught this quite a bit. I call it language reduced assessment. It goes by the name of nonverbal testing, right? And there's a lot of nonverbal tests out there. You have your choice. I have examples here. Here's a couple of good ones, right? Here's the Universal Nonverbal Intelligence Test. It's Bruce's test and Steve's test. And you have the Wechsler Nonverbal, which is a new one here, the Wechsler Nonverbal Scales of Ability by David Wechsler and Jack Naglieri. So you have a lot of things available. Now, do nonverbal tests solve the problem? All you got to do is give a nonverbal test. Oh, here's another one too. The lighter R. That's a real popular one. I think it's undergoing revision again because it's pretty darn old. But how do you give a nonverbal test? Do you just give a nonverbal test? Like Andrea, wasn't it, right? Andrea. I'm going to test Andrea. And I'm going to test her with my Universal Nonverbal Intelligence Test because it's universal, so it should be for everybody, right? Even ET. ET comes down, we're using the unit on ET. So I wait. Like, Andrea's not supposed to know, because she speaks a language I don't speak, and I don't speak a language she speaks, but I got my unit. And, I don't want her to know it. I'm ready to test her, so I kind of ignore her until she's not looking and not paying attention. Then I sneak up on her without saying anything, because it's nonverbal. I put the test in front of her, and I step back with my protocol, and I start taking notes. And I'm watching. She's smiling, which is okay, but I think that's a little inappropriate affect, don't you? Maybe we're looking at an ED evaluation later on, okay? She should be serious about this. Oh, but time's up on that one. So I just reach over, turn the page, put the next item in front of her, and I step back and I just continue watching. Okay? Well, she's not doing very well, huh? She's not doing so well. You can't give a test like that, right? Otherwise, I'm thinking, you're not doing very well, Andrea. But of course, she doesn't know because I can't communicate that to her. Can you give a test that way? Just plop it in front of somebody and say, here you go? No, that's not a real test. The test that we give requires to do certain things. We have to, I have to somehow communicate with Andrea, and I have to tell her what's a right answer, what's a wrong answer, when to start, when to stop, right? When to work quickly, all of these kinds of things. Now, I know you're saying, oh, wait. There's gestures on the unit. Yes, there are. There are 8 gestures that you can use to teach the person how to take the test, right? And you can administer the test with those gestures. So how do I teach Andrea those gestures if I don't speak the language that she speaks? How do I teach her the meaning of that? Are there nonverbal gestures to teach the nonverbal gestures? And think about it. Are all nonverbal gestures the same around the world? One of the ones on good job is thumbs up. That's a nice American one. You go to Australia and do that, you're going to get hit. They're not going to like you for doing that. Also in what is it, Italy? I was reading this one, but I forgot it already. Somewhere else. This is not a good thing to do. So if she happens to come from that country and I go like this, she's like, she's going to attack me, in which case we'd really do an ED evaluation. But nonverbal gestures, you have to be careful. They're very culturally bound, aren't they? Especially nonverbal gestures. However we communicate, whether it's gestures, and if I teach her 8 gestures, all I have done is teach her a language. Whether it's a nonverbal, gestural language, doesn't matter. Language is part and parcel of the testing process. We must be able to communicate in order to test effectively. Now, if we reduce the language component, do we also reduce the cultural component? Well, let's find out. If you're familiar with the unit, there's a test over here called object memory. And in object memory, there are cards with these black and white drawings on them, and you present the card to the child. Child looks at it for a few seconds. You take it away. Then they show them another card that has some of the drawings they saw before. Okay? And so you have to remember the ones you saw and remember that there are new ones that aren't ones you saw at all. So let's look at these items. I'm going to show them to Andrea here. Andrea, what is the first item on this card right at the top, right there?
A steak.
A steak, yeah. How do you know that's a steak?
T-bone.
Because it has a T-bone in it, right? So it's a T-bone steak. Yeah, no flies on you, right? You got it. Okay. T-bone steak. This form, is it cooked or uncooked?
Cooked.
Could be, right? Hard to say. It looked pretty much the same either way. So if it was in color, we could tell whether it was more cooked. But being in black and white, we don't know. is a steak cut in this way with the T-bone in the center? Is that something that's universal that all children from all cultures would recognize readily and be able to process metalinguistically, especially kids who come from countries like India where cows are sacred? Probably not. Cows have a Bill of Rights in India, okay? So they're not likely to know that. Now, what's right next to the steak there, Andrea? What is that?
Ham.
Ham. It is, right? It's a bone-in ham. Leg of ham, it's right there. It's got the bone in and everything. So is ham in this form something that all children from all cultures would recognize? Especially children who come from, kosher Jewish homes, right? Where they serve ham all the time when they're celebrating Christmas. And ham and steak. Definitely not a test for vegetarians, in case you're wondering. But what's the last item on the top row right there? She's looking at it carefully. She's now giggling.
Lettuce.
It's lettuce, okay. Is that your final answer?
Yes.
Lettuce, okay. Andrea says it's lettuce. And lettuce is not an uncommon answer, but it is not the right answer. Do you know what that is? And I'm not surprised you don't recognize it. Why? It's probably not a part of your cultural experience. You know what it is? It's not cauliflower either. That's the probably most common response. It's actually the cotton flour, known as the boll, B-O-L-L, the cotton boll. It is raw cotton in its natural state. And probably the last time any of you have seen cotton in that form was on the label of your underwear that you put on this morning, right? Because cotton, it's the fabric of your life. It's raw cotton. Now, are all kids, including Andrea, equally familiar with the way raw cotton looks? No. People in the South generally get this one. People north of the Mason-Dixon line, kind of like we are now, don't. And it's a cultural kind of issue. So the point is not that there is cultural content, because there is cultural content. It's just that we have to be aware that just because we reduce the language requirements doesn't mean we eliminate the acculturative learning component either. They often go together. Usually they do. But sometimes they're separated as well, and this can still make a difference in the test. If you knew what those items were, you're more easily able to remember them. So Andrea remembers steak, she remembers ham, she's thinking in her head, no problem. Meat, I can just keep that and I could figure it out. The cotton, she didn't know what it was. She called it cabbage, so now she could think, well, cabbage and meat, so it can be like produce or food, and that might help her remember them. But if she didn't know what any of those objects were, she couldn't engage in that process, and it would affect her ability to perform on the test. All right? And then test norms. The lighter, and this is it's old here, but this is the shiny. I got a new one of these. I didn't use it, but brand spanking shiny new brochure here, where the lighter says a totally nonverbal intelligence and cognitive abilities test. Right there, totally nonverbal. I just explained that's not really true, right? And then beneath it, it says no cultural or language bias. No cultural or language bias. Tish, is that what it says? Does it say that right there?
Yes.
Am I lying to them?
No.
I'm not lying, right? And what does it say underneath? No cultural or language bias.
New attention and memory domain.
No, not there. Right here, right there.
Fair for all cultural and ethnic backgrounds.
Fair for all cultural and ethnic backgrounds. Oh my God. All I had to do was walk in today and say, lighter R, any questions? Go home, right? Fair for all cultural and ethnic backgrounds. Let's find out how they work this sort of miracle piece of standardization here. Because to do that, they would have had to sample all cultures, all ethnicities around the world, put them into a controlled kind of situation, test them along the other dimensions of standard norm sample construction, which would include SES, gender, geographical location, and age, of course, and so on. So let's find out how they did this, okay? Inside here, right there, it says no evidence of cultural bias. They are so proud. And here's how they did it. Psychometric studies of possible test and item bias on Hispanic, African American, SES, and gender groups show the lighter R to have exceptional fairness for all cultural and ethnic backgrounds. Did I miss something here? Wait, they just said all cultural and ethnic backgrounds again, and they mentioned Hispanic and African American, which are racial categories, not ethnic, not heritage, not even cultural backgrounds, and then SES and gender, which are normal or standard norm sample construction variables. What's going on? All right, and then it says, also, since the lighter R is completely nonverbal, there is no dominant language bias. I love that wording, because you know what it means? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. It's a bunch of like ad speak and psychobabble. Dominant language bias. You see, but if you didn't know what it meant, you'd be thinking, I must be inadequate. I better get this test, right? Because I don't know dominant language bias. No such thing. Anyway, let's go back to the African American, Hispanic were the only two things they mentioned. Okay, how does being Hispanic capture your cultural background? I'm Puerto Rican, which is Hispanic. Does that mean I'm the same as everyone else? They said Hispanic. Now, Hispanic, and then they got African American. Well, Puerto Ricans, as I like to say, come in all flavors, including African, including white or Caucasian, and Native. Yeah, seriously, the colors of the Puerto Rican flag are red, white, and blue. You always thought, well, that's because the U.S. is red, white, and blue, and it's a U.S. territory. No, it stands for the colors of the people who have settled and inhabited the island. Red for the native Taino. The Taino people lived in the Caribbean and in Puerto Rico before they were, quote-unquote, discovered. Okay? The native Aboriginal people. They gave us words like hammock and barbecue and hurricane. Those are Taino words, which just goes to show that all Puerto Ricans really care about are, eating, sleeping, and the weather. Not much has changed, but then there's white. The white comes from the Caucasian influence. Remember the great explorers? Columbus, Ponce de Leon, all these guys came to the Caribbean as well, helped colonize the island. And what happened while they were there? I don't know if you know this, Columbus himself actually brought sugarcane cuttings from the old world and planted them in Puerto Rico and other places. And it grew like wildfire. And they're like, wow, great place to grow sugar. So African influence, because people were taken from their homeland and forcefully brought to Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico has an African heritage. It has a Caucasian heritage. It has a Native heritage. How does that capture me here on the lighter? Because they called me Hispanic. It doesn't. It doesn't have anything to do with my culture and so on. So culturative differences are not controlled by tests, even when in some cases a test may include individuals on the basis of being bilingual or not. Just because you include bilinguals doesn't mean you paid attention to the way in which those issues affect the development of the individual and what their performance should be like. So nonverbal tests are very good. I don't have any problems with them. You want to use them? Absolutely. They will tend to be less culturally loaded, less linguistically loaded than the other tests, but they're not free of culture, not free of language, and there are still problems with norm sample representation. So to pick a test and to just administer it and say, here, I've done my best, and now I have valid results, can't do it. The numbers that you generate from here are not going to be necessarily ones you can defend. And one of the other problems you have is, what about the majority of evaluations you conduct? For what disability are they usually performed? LD? Would you say most of your evaluations are for LD? Yeah. Right? Cognitive what? Yeah, you have intellectual disability as well. So mostly LD. Of those that are LD, how many are referrals for problems in the area of reading or writing? Almost all of them? There's a few math ones sprinkled in. Okay. So if you're evaluating reading and writing, is it important to know how the child is capable of performing in areas that are related to the acquisition of reading and writing? Areas such as GC, or crystallized knowledge, vocabulary, language development, right? Or areas like GA, phonological processing, phonological awareness, their ability to create and maintain sound symbol relationships. Those two areas would be important to evaluate, wouldn't they? Because they might explain why the child is having difficulty. How many of those areas are contained on nonverbal tasks? None. By definition, they remove GC and GA, which means that if you're evaluating for LD in the areas of reading and writing, you're not even measuring some of the most important abilities that predict the acquisition and development of reading or writing itself. And so therefore, you may miss some things that are very important. They are, by definition, because they're nonverbal, going to eliminate the range of abilities you're going to measure. And when you're evaluating, particularly for LD, I think it's important to have a more comprehensive view of the child's capabilities so that you know that there is evidence that they can perform well in areas that are in fact not deficient. That may not happen sufficiently with a nonverbal test. Before I get there, bilingual assessment. How many of you conduct evaluations in a language other than English? Okay, how many? 2 of you? I got 1, I got 2, I got 3. I got 3 of you. So do you 3 run around the entire state of Indiana doing all the assessments on the second language kids? You can't do it, right? All of you have got to do it. But there are very few of you, which is why, when I started in school psych, I really wanted to do just this. But I realized that when I would go someplace to talk about these issues, I would have 3 people in the room with me, because there are only 3 of them who could speak the language, who could feel or were believed to be competent enough to conduct evaluation in a native language. Now, the question is, since you speak the language, can't you just then pick up like the WJ3 or the Bateria 3 for Spanish or the WISC-4 Spanish and do your thing, right? All done. Simple. No. Here's one of the big problems with native language assessment. The tools are good and getting better. That's great. They're going to continue to improve. But we don't have really much research that tells us how do bilingual children perform on tests given to them in their native language, particularly when they're not being educated in their native language. You see the difference? That is a problem. Now, they've tried to address it a little bit. Bilinguals are included to a certain extent in the Bateria 3 norms, but not nearly enough. It's primarily normed on children who are, unfortunately, monolingual Spanish speakers. That's not who you're working with. If you have a kid who just arrived and has been educated and you want to evaluate them on day 1, you could use the Bateria 3 and it would be okay. But after about a few weeks, they're learning English, they're bilingual, they're emerging bilinguals, it's just not going to be appropriate. The other thing is with the WISC-4, they tried to provide you some norms, alternative norms. The WISC-4 doesn't actually have bilingual norms or norms for Hispanics. It has what is called linked and equated norms to the WISC-4 regular sample. This is a little bit of psychometric magic that publishers are using these days. And hey, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I know you thought I was going to say voodoo, but I did not. It is legitimate psychometric practice where they take a larger sample that has existed before and they make adjustments in current sampling on the basis of current population data, and then they adjust the norms to the new information. Almost all test publishers will do this within the next 10 years. The days of collecting actual norms are pretty much dead. Norms from now on will be computerized. They'll be linked and equated to older norms, adjusted as the population changes, because it's just too expensive for them to do it any other way. So it's happening. Okay, that's not in and of itself the problem. The problem is simply that because it's linked and equated, the regular norms on the WISC-4 are no different than the norms for English speakers. So you got a problem there. But number 2, they do provide alternative norms, right, based on country of origin. Those are used only for when the child has been, in fact, you're only supposed to use the WISC-4 when the child has been in the country less than 5 years. Because after 5 years, you use the WISC-4 in English. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Once a bilingual, always bilingual. Just because you become English dominant doesn't mean you cease to be bilingual. So there are problems with that. In country of origin, how does... I'm from, well, my parents are from Puerto Rico, so I'm Puerto Rican. Do you use Puerto Rican norms with me? What if those were based on kids who were educated in Puerto Rico and still live there, or just came here at a certain age, versus like my children who are Puerto Rican too, but whose parents weren't born there, but grandparents were? It's not that simple. And although, and I have to give test publishers credit, it is a movement toward addressing the issues, they're incremental and they're not right on just yet. So can you just give the WISC-4 in Spanish and get useful scores? No. You still are dealing with a population upon whom this test has not yet been normed or developed. So you get scores. How useful they are, I don't know. And the reason I say I don't know how useful they are is there's no research. What research do we have that tells us about how bilinguals perform on native language tests? You know where all the research is? It's over here in assessment of bilinguals. We know, and I showed you already, data dating back 100 years on how bilinguals perform on tests given to them in English. This is what allows all of you to be able to engage in the process of evaluating people who are not native English speakers. Because we have, for better or for worse. I'm not saying this was wonderful data that was collected by benevolent people. No. All right, that's not the way that it happened. But it happened. And it's there. And it's an evidence-based, and it's not disputable. It is basically unequivocal. It says bilinguals don't perform nearly as well as native English speakers. And, as I'm going to show you, it's not just like there's a difference. It's a linear difference. And that linear difference is based on the degree to which the tests require cultural knowledge and require language development. The more they require of those, the worse or the more attenuated the performance gets. The less they require, the better the performance is. If they can be eliminated almost completely, such as in nonverbal tests, some nonverbal tests, not all of them, the performance is nearly comparable. And that's what we need to know. So this evaluation, even though on the surface it seems like the most counterintuitive, what? You're going to test a non-native English speaker in English? Yes, to begin with. Because there is a chance that we can evaluate the validity. And if we find out that the validity is okay in our results, you can interpret. And you already know how to do that. And you don't even have to be extremely cautious. You can do it. All right? You don't. Please don't write that in your reports ever, okay? I tell my students, I fail them on the spot. They submit a report with the words extreme caution in there. I'm like, you don't even know what you're doing if you're writing it that way. And I certainly didn't teach you, and I'm not going to take credit for it. So you will interpret. You say your results are valid, interpret. If your results are not valid, do not go beyond the limits of what you can say about it. And I'm going to teach you how to be able to do that. So this is the approach. Ultimately, there is, a way to combine everything that will be good. If you look at the advantages and disadvantages and so on, you can see English language development is the only one that really makes it sort of feasible and practical in terms of working. Its only problem is that norm sample representation may cause the scores to be invalid. But that we can adjust for. The rest of it is kind of like hit or miss here or there. Ideally, the combination is going to be this plus either modified with a translator interpreter or native language if you can do the evaluation yourself.